The old pickup truck bounced along the dusty ranch road, kicking up clouds of dirt behind it. Inside, Maria Rodriguez gripped the steering wheel with hands that had seen years of hard work. Calluses marked her palms, and her fingernails carried traces of earth that never quite washed away. She squinted through the windshield at the vast landscape ahead. Double Creek Ranch stretched as far as the eye could see. Rolling hills covered in golden grass, scattered oak trees, and cattle dotting the horizon like dark spots on a painting. It was beautiful, but Maria wasn't here for the scenery. She was here to work. Her truck bed rattled with the tools of her trade. Post-hole diggers, wire stretchers, hammers, and coils of fencing wire. Everything she needed to fix what nature and time had broken. The work order in her shirt pocket was signed by someone named Ben Carter, and it promised to be her biggest job this year. As she pulled up to the main ranch house, Maria took a deep breath. First impressions mattered in her line of work. Too many ranchers still expected to see a man climb out of that truck. She'd learned to stand a little taller, speak a little louder, and never back down from a challenge. The ranch house was old, but well-maintained. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and rocking chairs sat empty in the afternoon shade. Somewhere nearby a dog barked, and she could hear the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields. Before she could knock on the door, it swung open. A tall man stepped onto the porch, adjusting a worn cowboy hat on his head. He was probably in his mid-30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of strong coffee. His boots were scuffed from real work, not just for show. Ben Carter stopped short when he saw her. His eyes went to the truck, then back to her face. She could practically see the gears turning in his head. "You looking for someone?" he asked, his voice carrying that slow drawl common to these parts. "I'm looking for Ben Carter," Maria replied, pulling the work order from her pocket. "I'm Monsieur Rodriguez. You called about fence repair." Ben's eyebrows shot up. He glanced at the paper in her hand, then back at her face. "You're the fence contractor?" There it was. The question she'd heard 100 times before. Maria straightened her shoulders and looked him dead in the eye. "That's right. Is there a problem?" "No problem," Ben said quickly, but she caught the uncertainty in his voice. "I just expected someone different." "Different how?" Maria challenged, crossing her arms. Ben had the grace to look embarrassed. "Honestly, I expected a man. Most contractors I deal with are men." "Well, today you get something different," Maria said with a slight smile. "But I promise you, my fences don't know the difference. They stay up just the same." Ben studied her for a long moment. She stood her ground, letting him look. She'd learned not to fill awkward silences with nervous chatter. Let them wonder. Let them doubt. Her work would speak louder than any words. "All right then," Ben said finally. "Let me show you what needs doing." They walked across the yard toward a four-wheeler parked near the barn. The ranch buildings were old but solid, built by people who understood that things needed to last out here. A few horses watched them from a nearby corral, their tails swishing lazily in the warm afternoon air. "How long have you been doing this?" Ben asked as they climbed onto the four-wheeler. 10 years, Maria answered. "Started working with my uncle when I was 18. He taught me everything he knew." "Where's your uncle now?" "Retired. Moved to Arizona. Said he was tired of fixing other people's problems." She paused. "I guess I'm not tired of it yet." Ben started the engine and they headed out across the ranch. The four-wheeler bumped over rough ground, following tire tracks that had been worn into the earth by countless trips like this one. As they rode, Ben pointed out landmarks. The creek that gave the ranch its name, the old homestead where his grandfather had lived, the pasture where he kept his prize bull. But Maria's attention was drawn to the fencing. Even from a distance, she could see the problems. Posts leaning at crazy angles, wire sagging or stretched too tight, gates that hung crooked on their hinges. Some sections looked like they'd been patched and repatched so many times that they were more patch than original fence. "Winter was hard this year," Ben explained, shouting over the engine noise. "We got ice storms that took down trees, and the cold made the wire brittle. Some of these sections are original to the ranch, been up for 40 years or more. They stopped at a particularly bad section where a fallen oak had crushed 20 feet of fence line. The tree still lay across the ground, its massive trunk blocking what used to be a gateway between pastures. Wire hung in twisted coils, and fence posts stuck up from the ground at odd angles like broken teeth." Maria climbed off the four-wheeler and walked along the damaged section. She pulled out a small notebook and began making notes. Post spacing, wire type, gate specifications. Ben watched her work, saying nothing. This tree came down in the storm? She asked, circling the fallen oak. About 3 months ago. I've been meaning to deal with it, but… Ben shrugged. Too many other things needing attention. Maria nodded. She understood. Ranching was a constant battle against entropy. Fix one thing and 2 more broke down. It was the nature of working with living things on land that stretched beyond the horizon. They spent the next hour driving from section to section. Each stop revealed new problems. A gate that wouldn't close properly because the posts had shifted. A stretch where cattle had pushed through weak spots, creating gaps they could escape through. Corner posts that had rotted at ground level, leaving the entire fence line unstable. How many miles total? Maria asked as they headed back toward the ranch house. About 12 miles of perimeter fencing plus another 8 miles of internal fencing to separate the pastures, Ben replied. And that's not counting the corrals and loading areas. Maria did quick math in her head. It was a bigger job than she'd expected, but not more than she could handle. It would take her the better part of 6 weeks working alone, maybe 8 weeks if the weather didn't cooperate. I can do it, she said simply. Ben glanced at her. All of it? All of it. By yourself? I work alone. Always have. They were quiet for the rest of the ride back. Maria used the time to think through the job. She'd need to order materials. A lot of materials. Wire posts, hardware, concrete for setting the corner posts. It would be expensive. But ranchers like Ben understood that good fencing was an investment that paid for itself over time. Back at the ranch house, Ben offered her a glass of water from a pitcher that sat sweating on the porch table. The afternoon had grown hot and dust from their ride clung to everything. When can you start? He asked. Soon as the materials arrive. I'll place the order tomorrow. Should have everything here by the end of the week. Ben nodded slowly. She could see him still wrestling with doubts, not about her ability necessarily, but about the whole situation. She'd seen it before. Ranchers who hired her often went through the same process. Surprise, skepticism, then grudging acceptance. Look, Maria said, setting down her water glass. I know this isn't what you expected. If you want to call someone else, I understand. No hard feelings. No, Ben said quickly. No, I don't want to call someone else. It's just… He paused, looking out across his land. This place means everything to me. My grandfather built it from nothing. My father expanded it. Now it's my turn to take care of it. And you want to make sure I can do that. Yeah. Maria stood up and pulled a business card from her wallet. It was simple. Just her name, phone number, and the words fence contractor underneath. But on the back were phone numbers. These are references, she said, handing him the card. 3 ranchers I've worked for in the past 2 years, call them. Ask them about my work. Ben took the card and studied both sides. I'll do that, good. And Ben? She waited until he looked up at her. I understand this place means everything to you. That's exactly why I'll treat it like it means everything to me, too. Something shifted in his expression then. The skepticism didn't disappear entirely, but it softened around the edges. I'll call you tomorrow with delivery details for the materials, Maria said, heading toward her truck. Maria, Ben called out as she opened the truck door. I hope you know what you're getting into. This isn't easy country to work in. She smiled and tipped an imaginary hat. Ben, if it was easy, you wouldn't need me. As she drove away from Double Creek Ranch, Maria caught sight of Ben in her rearview mirror. He was still standing on the porch, watching her truck disappear down the dusty road. She'd seen that look before, too. It was the look of a man hoping he'd made the right decision. Well, she'd made plenty of right decisions for plenty of ranchers. She didn't intend to stop now. The sun was starting to set as she reached the main highway, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was going to be a good job. She could feel it. And something told her that Ben Carter was going to be surprised by just how good her fences really were. The rooster crowed at 5:30 just like every morning, but Maria was already awake. She'd been staying at a small motel in town, the kind of place where the coffee was weak and the walls were thin, but she was used to it. Hotel rooms and motels had been her home for 10 years now. Ever since she'd taken over the business, she dressed in her work clothes, sturdy jeans, a long-sleeved shirt to protect her arms from wire cuts, and boots that had walked more miles than she cared to count. Her truck was loaded and ready to go. The materials had arrived yesterday exactly as promised, and now it was time to show Ben Carter what she could do. The drive to Double Creek Ranch took 20 minutes in the early morning light. The countryside was beautiful this time of day, with mist rising from the creek beds and the first rays of sun turning the grass golden. A few early rising cattle watched her truck pass, chewing thoughtfully as if considering whether this stranger belonged in their world. Maria had decided to start with the worst section first, the area where the oak tree had fallen. It would be the hardest work, but also the most visible. If she could turn that disaster into a strong, straight fence line, Ben would have no choice but to trust her with the rest of the job. She parked her truck near the fallen tree and began unloading her tools. Post-hole diggers, a come-along winch for stretching wire, a chainsaw for cutting up the tree, and dozens of other tools that most people wouldn't recognize but were essential for her work. The oak tree was massive, probably 100 years old before the ice storm brought it down. Its trunk was easily 3 feet across and its branches stretched in all directions. Getting it moved would be the first challenge. Maria had dealt with fallen trees before. The secret was patience and planning. You couldn't just attack it with a chainsaw and hope for the best. You had to understand how the tree was balanced, which branches were supporting the weight, and which cuts would release tension safely. She spent an hour just studying the tree, walking around it, looking at how it had fallen and what it had damaged. Only then did she fire up her chainsaw and begin the careful work of dismantling what nature had torn down. The sun climbed higher as she worked, and sweat began to bead on her forehead despite the cool morning air. Cutting up a tree was hard work, made harder by the precision required. Each cut had to be exact, releasing just enough tension, without causing the remaining sections to shift. Unexpectedly, she was so focused on her work that she didn't notice Ben approaching until she turned off the chainsaw to move to a new position. "Morning," he called out, carrying a thermos and 2 cups. "Morning," Maria replied, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. Ben looked at the progress she'd made. Already half the tree was cut into manageable sections and stacked neatly to one side. The other half still lay across the fence line, but it no longer looked like an impossible obstacle. "Thought you might want some coffee," he said, pouring from the thermos. "Thanks." Maria accepted the cup gratefully. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed. "You've been at this since dawn," Ben observed. "Best time to work. Cool air, no wind, and the cattle aren't moving around yet." Ben nodded, sipping his own coffee. "Most contractors I've worked with don't show up until 8 or 9. Most contractors aren't trying to prove themselves," Maria said with a slight smile. They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, drinking coffee and looking out over the ranch. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily, riding the thermals that were just beginning to form as the day warmed up. "I called your references yesterday," Ben said finally. Maria tensed slightly but kept her expression neutral. "What did they say?" "Tom Patterson said you rebuilt his entire north boundary after a tornado went through. Said it was the strongest fence he'd ever seen and you finished 2 weeks ahead of schedule." Maria nodded. She remembered that job. The tornado had turned a 1/4 mile of fencing into twisted scrap metal, but the challenge had been exhilarating. "Dave Murphy said you fixed a problem that 3 other contractors had given up on. Something about his bulls breaking through the same section over and over." "Bulls are smart," Maria said. "They find the weak spots and exploit them. Dave's problem wasn't the wire or the posts. It was the corner brace. The previous contractors kept fixing the symptoms instead of the cause. And Linda Chen said you were the most professional contractor she'd ever worked with, and she'd hire you again in a heartbeat." Maria felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Good references were worth their weight in gold in this business. "So I guess my question is," Ben continued, "why are you working alone? With references like that, you could have a crew of 10 guys working for you." It was a fair question and one Maria had asked herself many times. "I tried that once. Had 3 guys working for me, but I spent more time managing them than I did building fence, and at the end of the day, if something wasn't done right, it was still my name on the work." "So you went back to working alone?" "I went back to working the way I work best." She finished her coffee and handed the cup back to Ben. "Thanks for this. Time to get back to work." Ben watched her for a moment longer, then nodded. "I'll let you get to it. But Maria, if you need anything, materials, tools, whatever, just holler." The rest of the morning flew by. With the tree cut up and cleared away, Maria began the process of removing the damaged fence. Some of the posts could be salvaged, but most would need to be replaced. The wire was a total loss, twisted beyond repair by the weight of the falling oak. Digging post holes was the hardest part of fence building. Each hole had to be perfectly aligned, exactly the right depth and wide enough for the post while still being narrow enough to provide solid support. Maria had developed a rhythm over the years. Drive the diggers deep, twist to loosen the soil, lift out the dirt, repeat. The ground here was rocky, which made the digging harder but would make the fence stronger once it was complete. Rocky soil drained well and didn't shift as much during freeze-thaw cycles. It was good ground for building something that would last. By noon, she had cleared all the damaged material and dug 8 new post holes. Her shirt was soaked with sweat and her arms ached from swinging the post hole diggers, but she felt good. This was the kind of honest physical work that left you tired but satisfied at the end of the day. She was mixing concrete for setting the corner post when Ben appeared again, this time carrying a brown paper bag and a cold bottle of water. "Lunch," he said simply, setting the bag down on the tailgate of her truck. "You don't need to feed me," Maria protested, but her stomach growled audibly, betraying her. "My grandmother always said that anyone working on Carterland gets fed properly. She'd haunt me if I let you go hungry." Maria couldn't argue with that logic. She washed her hands with water from a jug in her truck and opened the bag. Inside was a thick sandwich made with what looked like homemade bread, sliced turkey, cheese, and crisp lettuce. There was also an apple and a handful of cookies wrapped in wax paper. "This is too much," she said, but she was already taking a bite of the sandwich. "It was delicious." "Figured you worked up an appetite," Ben said, leaning against the truck. "How's it going so far?" "Good. I'll have this section roughed in by the end of the day. Tomorrow I can start stretching wire and hanging the gate." Ben looked at the work she'd completed. The corner post was set in concrete, perfectly plumb and square. The line posts were evenly spaced and aligned so precisely that they looked like they'd been laid out with surveying equipment. "You do good work," he said quietly. "Thank you." "No, I mean really good work. I've seen a lot of fence in my time, and this is—" He paused, searching for the right words. "This is the kind of fence my grandfather would have built. The kind that lasts." Maria felt a warm glow of pride. Compliments from customers were nice, but there was something different about the way Ben said it. Like he really understood what went into building something right. They ate in companionable silence, watching the cattle in the nearby pasture. A few of the bolder ones had wandered over to investigate the activity, but they kept their distance, eyeing the humans with typical bovine suspicion. "Those your bulls?" Maria asked, nodding toward a group of particularly large animals. "Some of them. That big black one is Thunder. He's got an attitude, so watch yourself around him." As if he'd heard his name, Thunder lifted his massive head and looked directly at them. Even from 50 yards away, Maria could see the intelligence in his eyes. Bulls weren't just big cows. They were smart, territorial, and completely unforgiving if you made a mistake around them. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. After lunch, Ben headed back to whatever ranch work was occupying his day, and Maria returned to her fence building. The afternoon sun was warm on her back as she set the remaining posts, checking and double-checking each one with her level. Precision now would save headaches later. Setting posts was methodical work that left her mind free to wander. She thought about the job ahead, planning out the sequence of tasks that would turn miles of broken fence into something strong and reliable. She thought about Ben's grandmother and her rule about feeding anyone who worked on Carter land. She thought about the way Ben had looked at her work with genuine appreciation, not just politeness. By late afternoon, all the posts were set and the concrete was beginning to cue. 3 weeks into the job, Maria had fallen into a rhythm. Up before dawn, coffee from the motel's lobby, then the drive out to Double Creek Ranch as the sun painted the sky pink and gold. She'd made impressive progress on the fence repairs, working her way systematically around the property's perimeter. The weather had been perfect until Tuesday morning, when she woke to the sound of rain drumming against her motel window. Not a gentle spring shower, but the kind of hard, driving rain that turns dirt roads to mud and makes outdoor work impossible. She stood at the window, watching water cascade from the gutters and form puddles in the parking lot. The weather forecast called for storms all day. There was no point in driving out to the ranch. She couldn't set posts in this weather, and stretching wire in the rain was asking for trouble. But as she stood there drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup, her phone rang. "Maria?" Ben's voice came through clearly despite the static from the storm. "You planning to work today?" "Not in this weather. Wire gets slippery when it's wet and I can't dig holes in mud. That's what I figured. Listen, I've got some inside work that needs doing. Paperwork, planning stuff. If you want to come out anyway, you're welcome to wait out the storm here. Better coffee than what you're getting at that motel anyway. Maria hesitated. In 10 years of contracting work, she'd never spent a rainy day at a customer's house. She kept her relationships professional, did her job, and moved on. But something in Ben's voice made her reconsider. You sure? I don't want to impose. No imposition. Road gets pretty bad in weather like this anyway. Safer if you're already here when it really starts coming down. An hour later, Maria found herself sitting at Ben's kitchen table, a mug of genuinely good coffee warming her hands. The kitchen was comfortable and lived in, with worn wooden counters and copper pots hanging from hooks. Through the window, she could see sheets of rain sweeping across the pastures. This is quite a storm, she said, watching a tree branch blow past the window. Spring storms in Texas don't mess around, Ben replied, joining her at the table with his own coffee. We needed the rain, though. It's been a dry winter. Ben had spread ranch records across the table, cattle breeding charts, feed purchase receipts, veterinary records, the kind of paperwork that kept a ranch running but never seemed urgent until deadlines approached. Don't let me keep you from your work, Maria said. Actually, I could use a break from this stuff. Mind if I ask you something? Shoot. How did you end up in the fence business? It's not exactly a career most people stumble into. Maria wrapped her hands around her coffee mug and considered the question. She'd been asked it before, but usually by people who were more curious than genuinely interested in the answer. My dad owned a small construction company, she began. Nothing fancy, home repairs, small remodeling jobs, that kind of thing. I used to help him during summers when I was a kid. Learned to use tools. Learned to measure twice and cut once. Learned that there's satisfaction in building something with your hands. What happened to the business? Dad got sick when I was 17, cancer. He tried to keep working, but... She shrugged. Medical bills ate up the savings. Had to sell the business to pay for treatments. Ben's expression softened. I'm sorry. Dad recovered, thankfully. But by then, someone else owned his company and he was starting over at 55. That's when my uncle offered me a job with his fencing crew. The uncle who taught you about building fence that lasts. That's the one. Uncle Roberto. He was my dad's brother, and he had a different philosophy about business. He said big construction companies come and go, but people will always need good fence. Fencing is personal. It's about protecting what matters to you. Outside, thunder rumbled across the sky and the lights flickered briefly. What about you? Maria asked. Always been a rancher? Ben laughed. Not hardly. I grew up here, but I couldn't wait to leave. Went to college in Dallas, got a business degree, worked in corporate finance for 8 years. What brought you back? My dad had a heart attack. Mom called and said she needed help running the place while he recovered. I figured I'd stay a few months, get things organized, maybe help them sell. But you didn't sell. Couldn't bring myself to do it. This place has been in our family for 3 generations. My great-grandfather homesteaded the original section in 1892. My grandfather expanded it during the Depression by buying out neighbors who were going under. My dad modernized the operation, brought in better breeding stock, improved the facilities. Ben paused to sip his coffee, his eyes distant. The first morning I was back, I got up early and walked out to check the cattle. Sun was just coming up, mist rising off the creek. I stood there looking at land that 3 generations of my family had worked and improved and protected, and I realized I couldn't be the one to let it go. So you stayed. So I stayed. Quit my job in Dallas, sold my condo, moved back into my childhood bedroom. He grinned ruefully. My girlfriend at the time thought I'd lost my mind. Ex-girlfriend, I'm guessing. Very ex. She was a city girl through and through. The idea of living on a ranch was about as appealing to her as a root canal. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Maria found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did around customers. There was something about Ben that put her at ease. Maybe it was the way he talked about his family's land with such obvious love, or the fact that he seemed genuinely interested in her answers to his questions. Can I ask you something now? She said. Fair's fair. Do you ever regret giving up the city life? The corporate job? Ben considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss certain things. Good restaurants, museums, being able to go to a movie without driving an hour. But regret? He shook his head. No, this is where I belong. How do you know? Same way you know you're good at building fence, I guess. It just feels right. When I wake up in the morning, I look out at this land and think, this is mine to take care of. Not own. My grandfather always said you can't really own land. You just get to be its caretaker for a while. But I get to be the one making decisions about how to use it, how to improve it, how to make sure it's in better shape when I pass it on than it was when I inherited it. The storm intensified, rain hammering against the windows with renewed force. In the distance, Maria could see her truck parked near the barn, already surrounded by puddles. Looks like I'm stuck here for a while, she observed. Could be worse places to be stuck, Ben said with a smile. You hungry? I was about to make some lunch. I don't want to put you to any trouble. No trouble. I've got to eat anyway, and cooking for two isn't much harder than cooking for one. Ben proved to be a surprisingly good cook. He made grilled cheese sandwiches with thick slices of homemade bread and real butter, along with tomato soup that came from a can but tasted better than any restaurant version Maria could remember. They ate at the kitchen table while rain continued to lash the windows. This bread is incredible, Maria said, savoring another bite of her sandwich. My grandmother's recipe. She taught me to make it before she died. Said no man should depend on store-bought bread when he could make better himself. Smart woman. The smartest. She ran this ranch for 10 years after my grandfather died. Back when most people thought a woman had no business managing livestock and land. She proved them wrong. After lunch, they moved to the living room where a stone fireplace dominated one wall and comfortable furniture was arranged to take advantage of the view out the large windows. Ben built a fire to take the chill off the damp air, and Maria settled into an overstuffed armchair with a fresh cup of coffee. This is nice, she said, watching flames dance in the fireplace. Different from motel rooms, I'm guessing. Very different. Maria looked around the room, taking in family photos on the mantel. Bookshelves lined with everything from ranch management guides to classic novels, and the comfortable clutter of a space where people actually lived. How long since you've had company? Ben considered the question. Real company? Someone who wasn't here on business? Maybe 6 months. My neighbor Dave Murphy came over to watch a football game, but that was back in the fall. You don't get lonely? Sometimes, especially in the evenings. Days are busy enough that I don't think about it much, but when the sun goes down and it's just me and the dog? He shrugged. Ranch work is solitary by nature. You learn to live with your own thoughts. What about dating? Surely there are women in town who'd be interested in a successful rancher. Ben laughed, but there was no humor in it. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But most of the women I meet either want to change everything about ranch life or they romanticize it. They think it's all horseback rides at sunset and cozy evenings by the fire. They don't realize it's also getting up at 5 in the morning to check on sick cattle, working in 100-degree heat, and dealing with the fact that your income depends on things you can't control. Weather, cattle prices, feed costs, Maria nodded. She understood something about that kind of life. The uncertainty, the physical demands, the way people who'd never done the work had unrealistic ideas about what it involved. What about you? Ben asked. Ever think about settling down somewhere instead of moving from job to job? The question caught Maria off guard. She'd been asked it before. The last section of fence stretched along the creek that gave Double Creek Ranch its name. It was the most challenging part of the entire job. Rocky ground, uneven terrain, and the need to account for seasonal flooding that could wash out posts if they weren't positioned correctly. Maria had saved this section for last, partly because of its difficulty, but mostly because finishing it would mean the end of her time at the ranch. Over the past 5 weeks, she'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of her days here. The early morning drives through countryside that was becoming familiar. The satisfaction of watching broken fence lines transform into something strong and lasting. And yes, the daily conversations with Ben that had become the highlight of each workday. She was positioning a corner post when she heard the rumble of the four-wheeler approaching. Ben had taken to checking on her progress every morning, usually bringing coffee and sometimes staying to help with particularly challenging sections. Morning, he called out, dismounting and carrying the familiar thermos. Morning. Perfect timing, I could use a break. They'd established this routine weeks ago, but somehow it felt different today. Maybe it was the knowledge that her work here was almost finished, or maybe it was the way Ben seemed quieter than usual. less quick with his usual jokes and observations. "How much longer?" he asked, looking at the remaining work. 2 days, maybe 3 if I run into unexpected problems with the creek crossing." Ben nodded, but his expression remained serious. They drank their coffee in silence, watching the creek flow lazily between its banks. In a few months during the spring rains it would be a rushing torrent, but now it was peaceful, reflecting the morning sky like a mirror. "I've been thinking about what happens after," Ben said suddenly. After you finish the fence. After you move on to your next job." Maria felt something tighten in her chest. She'd been trying not to think about exactly that. "I've got a job lined up in New Mexico. Big ranch outside Albuquerque. Should keep me busy through the summer. New Mexico's a long way from here. That's usually how it works. I go where the work is." Ben was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he looked up, there was something in his eyes that made Maria's heart skip. "Maria, I need to tell you something. These past weeks, having you here, it's changed things for me. Changed how I think about this place, about my life. Ben, I don't think... Please let me finish. I know this probably sounds crazy. I know we haven't known each other very long. But I've never met anyone like you. You're strong and independent, and you build things that last. You understand what it means to take pride in your work. And when I think about you leaving, about going back to just me and the dog in the evenings..." He set down his coffee cup and turned to face her directly. "What I'm trying to say is, what I'm missing isn't just company. What I'm missing is a wife by my side, someone to share this place with, to build a life with, and I can't imagine wanting to build that life with anyone but you." The words hung between them like the morning mist rising from the creek. Maria felt her world tilt sideways. This was exactly the kind of complication she'd spent 10 years avoiding, the kind of attachment that could derail everything she'd built for herself. "Ben, She stopped, not sure what to say. Her heart was pounding, and her carefully constructed defenses felt suddenly fragile. "I know it's a lot to think about," Ben continued quickly. "I know your life is on the road, that you've got commitments, plans. But I had to tell you how I feel. I had to ask if maybe, possibly, you might consider staying, making this place your home too." Maria stood up abruptly, pacing to the creek's edge. The water flowed steadily past, indifferent to human complications. She'd always found comfort in flowing water. It knew where it was going, followed the path of least resistance, never stayed in one place long enough to get trapped. "This isn't fair," she said, not turning around. "What isn't fair? You can't just ask someone to change their entire life like that, to give up everything they've worked for. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I'm asking you to gain something, to gain a partner, a home, a future that we build together." Maria turned to face him, and the hope in his eyes nearly broke her resolve. "You don't understand. I've built my business around being mobile, being independent. I don't stay in one place. I don't do relationships that require me to be something other than what I am. What if I don't want you to be anything other than what you are? What if I love exactly who you are? The woman who can build fence better than any man I've ever hired, who takes pride in doing things right, who's strong enough to make her own way in the world. But you're asking me to give that up, to stay here and be a rancher's wife. I'm asking you to stay here and be my partner. Keep building fence if that's what makes you happy. Travel if you need to. I'm not trying to put you in a cage, Maria. I'm trying to offer you a home base, someone who believes in what you do and wants to support it." The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache. Part of her, a larger part than she wanted to admit, was tempted. The past weeks had been the happiest she'd been in years. The thought of waking up every morning knowing she'd see Ben, of having someone who genuinely cared about her day, of belonging somewhere instead of just passing through. It was appealing in ways that terrified her, but it was also impossible. "I can't," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, Ben, but I can't. This isn't who I am." Something died in Ben's eyes, but he nodded slowly. "I understand. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to try. I should probably finish up here and get going. I can have everything done by tomorrow evening." "Maria, don't leave early because of this. Finish the job properly. That's who you are, someone who finishes what she starts." The rest of that day was awkward in ways their previous interactions had never been. Ben found reasons to be elsewhere while Maria worked, and when their paths did cross, their conversations were polite but strained. The easy camaraderie they'd developed was gone. replaced by the careful distance of people trying not to acknowledge the elephant in the room. That evening, Maria sat in her motel room staring at a map of New Mexico. The job there would be similar to this one: miles of fence line, challenging terrain, a customer who needed her expertise. It should have felt like an adventure, the next chapter in her carefully constructed nomadic life. Instead, it felt empty. She kept thinking about Ben's words. Not just the proposal, but the way he'd talked about partnership, about supporting what she did rather than asking her to give it up. No one had ever offered her that before. The few men she'd dated had always seemed to see her career as a phase she'd eventually outgrow, not as something valuable in its own right. But staying would mean changing everything. It would mean taking a risk on something she'd never tried before, putting down roots, making a commitment to a place and a person. And what if it didn't work? What if she was terrible at being part of a couple? What if she missed the road so much that she ended up resenting both Ben and the choice to stay? The next morning, Maria arrived at the ranch determined to focus solely on finishing the job. She had maybe 8 hours of work left, setting the final posts, stretching the last section of wire, and installing the gate that would complete the creek crossing. But Ben was already there, wearing work clothes and gloves. "Thought you might want help with this last bit," he said simply. "Ben, you don't need to." "I want to. This is my fence too, and I'd like to be part of finishing it." Working together felt natural despite the tension between them. Ben had good instincts for the work, anticipating what Maria needed before she asked for it. He held posts steady while she checked their alignment. He helped stretch wire, keeping tension steady while she secured it to the posts. He didn't try to take over or prove himself. He just worked alongside her like a trusted partner. As they installed the final gate, Maria found herself thinking about what it would be like to work with Ben regularly. Not just on this job, but on all the projects that would come after. To have someone who understood the satisfaction of building something that would last. Someone who appreciated the skill and precision that went into doing the work right. "There," Ben said as they hung the gate on its hinges. "That's the last of it." Maria stood back and looked at their completed work. The gate was perfectly hung, opening and closing smoothly. The fence line stretched away in both directions, straight and strong and built to last. It was some of the best work she'd ever done. "It's a good fence," Ben said quietly. "Yeah, it is." They stood together in silence, both knowing this was the end. Tomorrow Maria would load her truck and drive away, and this chapter would be closed. "Maria," Ben said finally, "I know you've made your decision and I respect it. But I want you to know that these past weeks have been the best I've had in years. Getting to know you, watching you work, seeing the pride you take in what you do, it's been a gift. Ben, I'm not trying to change your mind. I just wanted you to know that. And I wanted to say that if you ever change your mind about staying in one place, about having a home base, the offer stands." No matter how much time passes, Maria felt tears threatening and blinked them back. She wasn't a woman who cried easily, but something about Ben's quiet acceptance of her decision. The job in New Mexico was everything Maria had expected. Miles of challenging fence line, difficult terrain, and a customer who appreciated quality work. The pay was good, the weather was favorable, and she completed the project 2 weeks ahead of schedule. It should have been satisfying. It should have felt like another successful chapter in her carefully constructed career. Instead, Maria found herself thinking about Texas. She thought about it while she worked under the blazing New Mexico sun. She thought about it during long evenings in anonymous motel rooms. She thought about it while driving the endless highways that connected one job to the next. More specifically, she thought about Ben. She thought about the way he'd brought her coffee every morning, and how he genuinely cared about the quality of her work. She thought about the day they'd spent together during the storm, talking and laughing like old friends. She thought about the hope in his eyes when he'd asked her to stay, and the quiet dignity with which he'd accepted her refusal. After New Mexico came a job in Colorado, then one in Wyoming. Good work, fair pay, satisfied customers, but something had changed. The satisfaction she'd always found in completing projects and moving on was missing. The freedom she'd treasured for 10 years was starting to feel more like aimlessness. She tried to shake it off. This was just a rough patch, she told herself. Everyone had doubts sometimes. The important thing was to keep moving forward, keep building her reputation, keep following the path she'd chosen, but the doubts persisted, growing stronger with each passing week. It was in Wyoming that she got the call. "Maria, this is Dave Murphy. I'm a neighbor of Ben Carter's down in Texas." Maria's heart skipped. She remembered Dave. Ben had mentioned him several times, and she'd met him briefly when he'd stopped by the ranch to look at her fence work. "Hi, Dave. What can I do for you?" "Well, I've got some fence problems that I think you might be able to help with. Major storm came through last month and tore up about 3 miles of my north boundary. I've heard good things about your work from Ben, and I was wondering if you might be available." Maria hesitated. Taking a job near Double Creek Ranch would mean being close to Ben again, seeing him around town, probably having him stop by to check on Dave's fence the way neighbors did. It would be torture, but it would also mean going back to Texas, back to country that had started to feel more like home than anywhere she'd been in years. "When would you need me to start?" she heard herself asking. "Soon as you can get here. I've got cattle scattered across 2 counties right now, and I need that fence line secure before winter sets in. I'll be there next week." The drive from Wyoming to Texas gave Maria plenty of time to think. She told herself she was taking the job because it was good work and fair pay, nothing more. She told herself she was professional enough to work in the area without letting personal feelings complicate things. She told herself a lot of things, but she wasn't entirely convinced by any of them. Dave Murphy's ranch was smaller than Ben's, but just as well maintained. The storm damage was extensive, not just broken fence, but uprooted trees and scattered debris that would need to be cleared before repairs could begin. "Worse than I thought it would be," Maria admitted after surveying the damage. "Yeah, it was a hell of a storm. Ben lost some fence too, though not as much as me. His fence line held up better." Dave paused meaningfully. "Of course, he had it rebuilt recently by someone who really knew what she was doing." Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her expression neutral. "This will take about 3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on how much tree clearing I have to do. Take your time. I want it done right." The work was familiar and satisfying. Maria fell back into her rhythm. Early mornings, methodical progress, the satisfaction of transforming chaos into order. But she found herself glancing toward the south more often than necessary, knowing that Double Creek Ranch lay just a few miles in that direction. She'd been working for a week when she saw the familiar figure on horseback approaching across the pasture. Ben rode easily, the same paint mare she remembered from their last day working together on the creek crossing. Maria's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept working, pretending not to notice him until he was close enough to speak. "Morning, Maria." "Morning, Ben." He dismounted and ground-tied his horse, then walked over to examine her work. The fence line was taking shape nicely, straight, strong, and built to withstand whatever weather Texas might throw at it. "Good to see you're still building fence that lasts," he said quietly. "That's what I do." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Maria wanted to ask how he'd been, whether he was well, whether he'd thought about her even a fraction as much as she'd thought about him, but those weren't the kinds of questions you asked when you'd made the choice she'd made. "Dave says the storm damage was pretty extensive," Ben said finally. "Worst I've seen, but it's nothing that can't be fixed with time and patience." "Good. Dave's a good neighbor. We help each other out when we can." Another silence fell between them. Ben shifted his weight, and Maria sensed he wanted to say something more. "Maria, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you happy with the way things worked out?" The question caught her off guard. She looked up from the fence post she'd been adjusting and met his eyes, for the first time since he'd arrived. "I'm fine," she said, automatically. "That wasn't what I asked." Maria set down her tools and really looked at him. He seemed thinner than she remembered, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. "Are you happy, Ben?" "Some days. Other days," he shrugged. "Other days I wake up and think about what it would have been like if you'd said yes." "Ben, I'm not trying to pressure you or change your mind. I miss you, Maria. I miss having someone to talk to who understands what it means to build something that matters." Before Maria could respond, Ben swung back up onto his horse. "I should let you get back to work. But Maria, it's good to see you again. Really good." He rode away across the pasture, leaving Maria staring after him with her heart in her throat. That evening, sitting in another motel room in another small town, Maria finally admitted what she'd been trying not to acknowledge for months. She wasn't fine. She wasn't happy. And she missed Ben every bit as much as he apparently missed her. The realization should have been liberating, but instead it left her feeling more confused than ever. What was she supposed to do with that knowledge? She'd built her entire adult life around independence and mobility. She didn't know how to be part of a couple, how to stay in one place, how to be anything other than what she'd always been. But maybe, she thought, that was exactly the problem. Maybe she'd been so focused on protecting what she had that she'd never considered whether what she had was really what she wanted. The next morning, Maria woke before dawn with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. Instead of driving straight to Dave's ranch, she took a detour that led past Double Creek Ranch. She told herself she was just curious about how her fence was holding up. Professional pride, nothing more. But when she saw a section of fence that had been damaged by the same storm that hit Dave's place, she pulled over without thinking. The damage wasn't extensive, maybe 50 feet of fence line where a tree had fallen. But it was her fence she'd built with her own hands, and it needed repair. Maria unloaded her tools and got to work. She was so focused on the job that she didn't hear Ben approaching until he spoke. "I thought that was your truck," Maria looked up to find him standing a few feet away, coffee mug in hand and an expression of surprise on his face. "Storm damaged this section," she said simply. "Figured I should fix it. You don't work for me anymore. Maria, this isn't your responsibility. Good fence is always my responsibility." Ben walked closer, examining the repair work she'd already completed. "You could have just called me. Told me it needed fixing? Could have, but I was driving by anyway." They both knew that was a lie. The main road didn't go anywhere near this section of fence. Maria had gone out of her way to find this damage. "Why?" Ben asked quietly. Maria straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her glove. It was a fair question, and she owed him an honest answer. "Because I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about what you said, about what you offered." Ben went very still. And I've been thinking about what makes me happy, really happy. Not just satisfied or accomplished, but genuinely happy." She gestured toward the fence she was repairing. "I'm good at this work. I take pride in it. I've built a successful business doing it. But this past year, driving from job to job, staying in motel after motel, something was missing." What was missing? Someone to share it with. Someone who understands why I do what I do and supports it. Someone who makes me want to build something more than just fence. Ben set down his coffee mug and took a step closer. "Maria, what are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been an idiot. I'm saying I let fear make my decisions instead of my heart. I'm saying that if the offer is still open, if you still want a partner who builds things that last." She didn't get to finish the sentence because Ben was kissing her, his hands framing her face like she was something precious and fragile and worth protecting. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard.